I'm Megan Duffy. As you can see, I'm in Gaston Hall tonight where Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren discussed collateral damage, national interest, and the lessons of a decade of conflict with the Georgetown community. Please stay tuned as GUTV brings you the Senator's remarks as well as her answers to students' questions.
Elizabeth Warren, Senator from Massachusetts.
I know all the applause are really for you, but I like them anyway. Thank you. So good evening and welcome to the 2014 Whittington Lecture. My name's Edward Montgomery and I'm the Dean of the newly founded McCourt School of Public Policy. This event honors Dr. Leslie Whittington, a professor of public policy and associate dean at Georgetown, who died in the terrorist attacks on September 11th, along with her husband Charlie and their daughters Zoe and Dana. Leslie joined Georgetown in 1996, and during her tenure here, she taught economics and public finance. She's remembered as a first-class educator, a champion of our students who demanded their best work. She was a beloved member of our community. Each year, we pause at this lecture to honor her memory and to thank her for her contributions to the Georgetown community. We also use this occasion to award a scholarship in her name to a second-year McCourt School student who has demonstrated academic excellence and a commitment to smart public policy. This year's winner is Colin Hutter, an outstanding student and leader in our community. He has served as the treasurer of the Georgetown Public Policy Student Association and is one of our admissions ambassadors, an important resource for prospective students. I was going to say more about him. He's also the treasurer of Hoya Circles, Georgetown's first multicultural-focused graduate student organization, and he regularly volunteers in the D.C. community with organizations like the public school system, local armed services retirement home, and the Cesar Chavez Public Charter School. Please join me in congratulating Colin again. It is an honor to be joined today by Elizabeth Warren, the senior senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I believe Leslie would be honored to have Elizabeth Warren, a champion of so many causes herself, deliver our annual lecture in her name. While she is relatively new to the Senate, Senator Warren has already had an accomplished career as an academic and a public servant. She was a professor at Harvard Law School where she taught courses like commercial law and contracts and bankruptcy for nearly 20 years. She's one of our nation's leading bankruptcy experts and served as the chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel for Troubled Assets for the TARP program formed in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. In her run for the Senate, the Boston Globe called her a fierce advocate for the lot of working families. To say that she's been characterized as a thorn in the side of Wall Street is an understatement, but Senator Warren has made it her mission to advocate for Main Street America, the middle-class families and consumers who form the backbone of our economy. This has led her to champion beefing up the regulatory controls on our banking and financial service industries, controls she believes are integral to the success of our free market. She is credited with conceiving and building the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, a government agency set up in the wake of the financial crisis to protect consumers from abusive lending practices. She is also very vocal on an issue near and dear to many in our audience, the issue of mounting student loan debt for our young people and its ripple effect on the economy. While Georgetown works hard to hold down its debt burden, we know that this $1.2 trillion problem is a nationwide challenge. In fact, the first legislation she introduced as a senator was to aim to bring student loan interest rates in line with interest rates at the Federal Reserve offers to big banks. So she's only getting started in the Senate. It is clear that this senator will not shy away from taking on big problems and offering solutions that some find controversial. No doubt, Senator Warren recognizes that change will come slowly and it's a long game, and that change often starts with the kinds of conversations we're going to have here tonight. Today, we gather to participate in an essential and revered Georgetown tradition, free and spirited debate. It's why many of our students choose the McCourt School. It's the opportunity to engage with leading policymakers like the senator and on important topics of the day, and it's an essential element in their training and development. I want to thank Senator Warren for being the first Whittington lecturer at the new McCourt School of Public Policy. I'll keep saying the new McCourt School of Public Policy, which was created by another Bay Stater, an alumnus, Frank McCourt, just this last October. We look forward to hearing what you have to say today on the state of foreign policy in the United States. On behalf of the McCourt School wonks and 130 Hoyas from the Bay State, welcome to Georgetown. Please join me in welcoming Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Dean Montgomery, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the Georgetown Public Policy Institute for having me here today. I am very grateful. It is a great honor to deliver this year's Whittington Lecture and to be part of a living memorial to Leslie Whittington. It has been 13 years since the events of September 11th, 2001. We may remember different parts of the tragedy of that day, but some pieces are burned into our collective memory. The towers falling, one and then the other, the plane crash in Pennsylvania, the attack on the Pentagon, and the flight that took Professor Whittington. The fear, the courage, the grief. For 13 years, we have lived through the repercussions of that terrible day. And now, the first chapter in our nation's post-9/11 history is coming to an end. We are out of Iraq, and the drawdown in Afghanistan is underway. We are ending 2 wars, but this does not mean that we will withdraw from the world beyond our shores or pretend that there are no threats to our safety and security. As we start a new chapter, we still live in an unstable world, a world with terrorists plotting to cause catastrophic destruction, a world with dictators and tyrants, a world with threats in cyberspace and new technologies. We know that we must remain vigilant, taking steps to defend our allies and to protect our people. But as these 2 wars come to an end, we also have an opportunity to think about what we can learn from the last decade of conflict. There are many questions we can ask to make sure that our actions advance our national interests. How do we best balance liberty and security? What role, if any, should nation building play in our military strategy? When, if ever, should we engage in a so-called war of choice? These questions have been asked often by academics, by students, and by experts. Today, I want to focus on a related question about how we advance our national interests, a question that is discussed less often, but one that I think deserves attention. And that is, how should we think about civilian casualties and their effect on our strategic decisions? This is a difficult subject. Civilian casualties are an inevitable consequence of war, and modern conflict has made it more difficult to know who is innocent. We can't always distinguish between civilians and combatants. We no longer meet the enemy on a pitched battlefield, and they rarely wear uniforms to identify themselves. But the difficulty of navigating this issue does not mean that we can ignore it. Seriously addressing the issue of civilian casualties is essential to upholding our values at home and advancing our interests overseas. Our military is the most professional and honorable fighting force in the world, and I know firsthand how creative and tough our armed forces are. All three of my brothers served in the military. My oldest brother flew 288 combat missions in Vietnam. I am proud of their commitment and proud to have grown up in a family that honors military service. As a country, we take pride in the way our service members conduct themselves. But some people assume that when the shooting starts, military law, domestic law, and international law are left behind. The reality is exactly the opposite. Law is an integral part of American warfare. Our soldiers learn basic legal principles as part of their training. Military lawyers are embedded into our fighting units, working alongside commanders to evaluate the legality of even the most sensitive decisions. We follow law because our values and our national interests demand it. Under the laws of war, we have an obligation that requires our military to distinguish between civilians and combatants. The laws recognize the possibility of collateral damage and therefore require us to weigh the military advantage gained from an attack against the humanitarian costs that are incurred. The laws of war are realistic, but the laws of war require us to consider not just expediency, but also humanity. Adhering to our legal principles is not easy, and the realities of modern combat have not made it any easier. But our experiences teach us that success within a conflict itself requires us to do our absolute best to minimize civilian casualties. So, General Stanley McChrystal, the former commander of our armed forces in Afghanistan, described a lesson from a few years ago. Commenting on the military effort to eliminate insurgents, he described something he called counterinsurgency mathematics, and I want to read this to you. Here's what he said. Let us say that there are 10 insurgents in a certain area. Following a military operation, 2 are killed. How many insurgents are left? Traditional mathematics would say that 8 would be left. But General McChrystal said that's not always the right math. His calculation, there could be as many as 20, because each one you killed has a brother, a father, a son, and friends who do not necessarily think they were killed because they were doing something wrong. It does not matter. You killed them. Suddenly then, there may be 20, making the calculus of military operations very different. McChrystal describes this dynamic with insurgents, but the same dynamic is at work with collateral deaths of innocent civilians. And the same dynamic can apply to all kinds of military operations, special forces missions, counterterrorism operations, and efforts to train security forces. Over the past decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, military commanders increasingly tried to address this problem. They began to express public regret, offer consolation payments, pay for property damage, and make other gestures of respect to the families and to the communities that were harmed by conflict. Commanders in the field developed relationships with local leaders, which improved communication and understanding after incidents. When tragedies occurred, instead of issuing blanket denials, commanders launched independent investigations to determine what really happened. Over time, what began as after-the-fact compensation evolved into a more robust preventive system. The military increased its efforts to educate and train our soldiers and Marines on civilian protection. And leaders in the military started tracking the number of civilian casualties so they could learn from the statistics and identify ways to lower civilian casualty rates. The military went to great lengths because it was right and because it made good strategic sense. As the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan progressed, our military leaders increasingly took seriously the costs of civilian casualties in military engagements, and they learned important steps in how to prevent civilian casualties. But now it's time for the next question. When our country considers military interventions abroad, and especially when leaders publicly debate the costs and benefits of using force, do we factor in this lesson? Do we fully consider the costs of civilian casualties? When military action is on the table, do we fully and honestly debate the risk that while our actions would wipe out existing terrorists or other threats, they might also produce new ones? Do we talk seriously about the price our great nation, built on the foundation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, may pay if others come to believe that we are indifferent to the deaths of civilians? Do we fully take into account the effect on our interests if people around the world are inflamed by such casualties, or if they do not believe that our actions align with our values? Many policymakers in Washington seem hesitant to broach the subject and to ask these questions, hesitant to acknowledge the reality that military commanders have dealt with every day, the reality that civilian casualties harm U.S. interests abroad. And when we debate the costs and benefits of intervention, when we discuss potential military action around the world, the talk about collateral damage and civilian casualties too often seems muted. The failure to make civilian casualties a full and robust part of our national conversation over the use of force is dangerous. Dangerous because of the impression that it gives to the world about our country, and dangerous because of how it affects the decisions we make as a country. Our decision-making suffers, and our ability to effectively advance our interests suffers when we do not grapple fully and honestly with all of the costs and benefits, all of the risks, all the unintended and intended consequences of a military action. When our country considers military intervention, we must be hard-headed and clear-eyed. It is critical to consider the chaos and factionalization that can arise in the wake of military intervention, critical to evaluate the potential for military intervention to spark an insurgency or fuel a civil war, critical to consider the possibility that civilian casualties in one conflict could be used as a recruiting tool or a rallying cry for extremists elsewhere in the world. Unintended consequences have a profound impact. Whatever righteous our intentions, the world does not hold us blameless when civilians die. Over the past decade, military leaders in the field learned about the importance of minimizing civilian casualties. And now, as we wind out of 2 wars, we must institutionalize those lessons so they will never be forgotten. This process starts now. We must begin by establishing training programs that directly affect civilian casualties. The military has begun to put together educational and training materials based on experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. We should support these efforts and make sure that preventing civilian casualties is part of our military's future education, future training, and future planning process. Next, we need to improve our efforts to track civilian casualties during any military engagement. In 2008, 7 years into the war in Afghanistan, commanders established civilian casualty tracking teams to identify what happened after an incident, to investigate and collect data on the incident, to analyze trends, and to advise them on what they could do to reduce those casualties. Now is the time to establish best practices for tracking future civilian casualties from the first day of any conflict. While secrecy, particularly as it relates to operational plans, is necessary in some cases, tracking casualties and making those data publicly available will help us make the best decisions here at home and demonstrate to the world that America takes civilian casualties seriously. Good data will enable our military to improve practices and to provide reliable evidence to push back against rumors and misinformation advanced by our enemies. Finally, we should establish best practices for what to do in the wake of civilian casualties. In Iraq and Afghanistan, commanders on the ground began to find ways to express regret and to compensate families. Now is the time to think systematically about these kinds of efforts and to incorporate them into our military training and planning. In 2010, when he was commander of U.S. coalition forces in Afghanistan, General David Petraeus issued a directive, an order designed to guide conduct and operations, and he defined the nature of the conflict. His directive stated, this effort is a contest of wills. Our enemies will do all they can to shake our confidence and the confidence of the Afghan people. In turn, we must continue to demonstrate our resolve to the enemy. We will do so through our relentless pursuit of the Taliban and others who mean Afghanistan harm, through our compassion for the Afghan people, and through the example we provide to our Afghan partners. And then he said, we must continue, indeed redouble, our efforts to reduce the loss of innocent civilian life to an absolute minimum. Every Afghan civilian death diminishes our cause. If we use excessive force or operate contrary to our counterinsurgency principles, tactical victories may prove to be strategic setbacks. Our military leaders recognize that our moral values need not conflict with our strategy. As we reflect on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as we prepare for the future use of military force, we must remember this as well. We are a great country. We are a country rooted in the values of liberty and justice, compassion and community. We cannot turn a blind eye to the rest of the world, pretending that dangerous dictators pose no threat to us or that atrocities committed outside our borders don't matter. But when we consider whether to use force and when it will be in our national interest, we also should not, we cannot turn a blind eye to the impact of civilian casualties. The decision to use military force is one of the most important any country can make. If we openly consider all of the costs and benefits, all the unintended and intended consequences, we will make better decisions, decisions that will live up to our nation's core values, advance our national interests, and preserve our role as a moral leader in the world. Thank you.
So we have a little bit of time for some question and answers, which we have gotten from students and people in the audience, as well as some which were submitted ahead of time. I'm going to assert executive privilege and ask the first question myself. And so you had talked about the military having to train and be responsible and think proactively about the loss of casualties. As you apportion responsibility, how much falls on the president or the Joint Chiefs of Staff who designed the strategy, how much on the commanders of the field, and how much on the individual GI who may actually be in harm's way? How do you see the relative responsibilities or roles of those?
So the way I see this is that we went into Afghanistan and Iraq without a focus on civilian casualties in the same way. We had other parts of our mission that we were focused on, and that our soldiers on the ground began to teach us the importance of paying close attention to civilian casualties in this very different kind of war. You know, it's very different from a war in which everyone wears uniforms and we meet on pitched battlefields. They taught us, and their leaders taught us, and that's why it was that I wanted to talk about what General McChrystal said about this, what General Petraeus said about this. They said that civilian casualties, and pay attention to civilian casualties, and learning ways to reduce the number of civilian casualties is not only right morally, but it's also right strategically. It is more effective for this country. And so the real point now is to take that lesson on up the chain of command. This has to be something, in my view, that has to be absorbed into the military and into our leadership. We need to have this as part of our national conversation. That's true for all of us. So I see this as a question of the responsibility borne not just by those in the field, but responsibility borne by all of us.
All right, so have some questions here for you. A lot of domestic policy and some international policy across the board. So let me see if which one I'll start with. All right.
That's a good one.
This one? Okay, you like that one. All right.
I really can't see it.
Women are underrepresented in Congress.
That is a good one.
Do you?
So true.
Do you feel that the women who are in Congress face barriers to getting their voices heard? And how do you think we can overcome these barriers to getting women elected to office?
Well, the best way we can have our voices heard is if there were more of us. So my first part on this is we got to have women who are willing to get out there and try, who are willing to run for office. You know, God, I got to say, I'm one of those, being in Congress is kind of a second career for me. I really never thought I would run for any public office. And Stephanie Shrion of Emily's List came to see me, and she said two things to me that were really important in this. Early on, she said, you really should think about this. And one point she made is because when you run, you make it easier for the next woman to run. So every time a woman gets out there and takes a swing at the fences, it makes it a little bit easier for somebody else to try it. And then the second thing she said is if you will run, women will be there to help you all along the way. One woman helps another woman. And I think that's true. And I think that's part of how we're going to get more women. We're going to get more women in the political process, and those women are going to hand over hand help more women, which is not to say that friends of women cannot be helpful too. We take everybody in this, but it really is part of it. It's different to have the women in the Senate. Look, we have our differences. There are issues on which we do not agree. We vote differently. But we've also made a real effort to support each other. We have dinner together on a regular basis. When the government was shut down, it was women who at least jumped outside the standard channels and said it's time to do something and move forward. And it's women, again, not all of them, but some who stand up and talk about the expanded sense of what women's issues are. Look, there's some key ones we've got to do. Equal pay for equal work. It's time. But to talk about both how laws we have passed are women's issues, I'll give you mine, the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act is the first time we said as a country in federal law, being a woman is not a pre-existing condition that an insurance company can price against, can discriminate against. Not doing that anymore. And that is a very powerful statement for a country like ours. But also looking at things like minimum wage. Minimum wage workers are women twice as often as they are men. That is, women outnumber men working at minimum wage by 2 to 1. If we raise the minimum wage to $10.10 over the next 3 years, we will not only help lift millions of women, we will lift the economic fortunes of 17 million children in this country. So there are issues we get out and fight for, and we make it clear what makes them women's issues and that women will speak out on these issues. I think it's important.
You had mentioned the government shutdown that many people think means that the Congress is broken. Could you think of 3 things, if you were in charge, that we might do differently in the executive branch, say, or elsewhere, to make sure that Congress is more responsive to the needs of the citizen?
Did I hear a banker whimper somewhere? Just the thought. No, I'm just kidding, guys. So let's think about this. Okay, in the legislative branch, I'm in the United States Senate. We need to reform the filibuster rule. Come on. We've made some reforms, but remember how this one teed up. This is just really astonishing to me, now that I'm there and you see it up close. The Republicans had just decided that nobody was going to get confirmed to the 3 vacancies on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And it wasn't because the people that President Obama nominated were not people of incredible credentials. They had terrific credentials. It was that no one was going to get nominated or get confirmed who was nominated by this president. Why? Because they liked the ratio of 9 out of the 13 judges sitting in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals were nominated by Republican presidents. And they thought that gave them a lot of outcomes that they really liked out of that court. And so they were just going to block anybody getting into these vacancies. And there just comes a time when you say, we can't do this anymore. So we finally said, no, we're going to reform the filibuster rule enough that on a vote of 51, we can at least move it forward. But boy, we didn't change the filibuster rule, notwithstanding how much this has been discussed as the nuclear option. We did not change it fully. So we are caught in a filibuster every judicial nomination right now. And it's 2 hours for this and 8 hours for that and 6 hours for this, and it holds over to the next weekend. So that the process, it's like someone hasn't just thrown a handful of sand into the gears. It's like they have picked up a bucket of sand and thrown it into the gears. And it means we're not spending time on the floor of the United States Senate talking about minimum wage. We're not spending time on the floor of the United States Senate talking about unemployment insurance. We are not spending time on the floor of the United States Senate talking about student loans. And so my first one would be, if you're going to give me a legislative branch, I'll go for reform the filibuster. Over on the executive side, I got to tell you, it's the agencies. We look so much at the president when you think of the executive branch. Now I look at the agencies, because that's where so much both is going on and should be going on that isn't going on. So let me give you, I still have 2 wishes left. Okay, 2 wishes. Okay. I want to count these down, okay, when I've got the possibility here. I think the first one would be transparency about these agencies. So much policy in America is being made at the agency level, and we're just not seeing a lot of it. And actually, I will give you an example out of this. A few years back, the largest mortgage servicers in the United States decided as a business model that following the law was so last year. And and expensive. I mean, it really cut in to the bottom line profits. So they figured, you know, like you're supposed to have these affidavits where somebody's really verified the truth of something. It was a lot easier to hire somebody at minimum wage to just sign them all, you know, and just push them on through, to declare things that weren't true and get it all done. When it came out that they had violated the law and were subject to potentially pretty severe legal consequences, they decided to cut a deal with the banking regulators who were in charge. And so, long process, ultimately the banking regulators stand side by side with the representatives of the largest financial institutions, and they hold up these big signs about how many billions of dollars that these shenanigans were settled for. So no, there's not going to be any trial. No, there's not going to be any public parading of what they've done wrong, but they are going to write a check for a really big number, a truly, remember Austin Powers, you know, $1 million. Okay, so they're going to write this really big check. But what they don't tell, what they didn't tell, were a couple of like key things about that big, big number. One was whether or not it was going to be tax deductible. Think about that, right? So yeah, we wrote this big check. Now it's tax deductible, which means effectively it was just subsidized by all of you, the taxpayer, the penalties they paid. Or here's another, the clever ways in which the payment would be calculated. So for example, on this particular one, on the settlement, they agreed that they would go out and they would modify a certain number of mortgages and they get credit every time they, sounds reasonable, right, as part of the multi-billion-dollar settlement. But here was the deal. So they decided to modify a $500,000 mortgage. The bank says, we'll knock $15,000 off a $500,000 mortgage that you're having a problem for. How much credit do you get? Well, I would think you get $15,000 credit, right? Because that's how much you're actually theoretically out of pocket. You might never have collected anyway, but I'll give you that. The answer is no, you got $500,000 in credit under the settlement because that was the size of the mortgage that was modified, not the amount that you gave up. So it's things like that. And here's how I think of it. It's not that the folks in the regulatory agencies are bad. They're not. But the wind blows one way through the regulatory agencies every day. And it's the direction of those who can hire the lobbyists, who can hire the PR people, who can hire the lawyers to show up and push, push, push. Transparency is our shot at least shining a light on it and getting that to tilt back. And I guess that means, I'll tell you where I'd spend my third wish, because it's in the same area. It would be on enforcement. So, look, I went to Washington, and I recognized, I was pretty clear-eyed about this. It's hard to get legislation through Congress right now. I mean, it is really hard. With the division between the House and the Senate, with the filibuster rule, with just the enormous divisions on key issues. I get that. But there's a lot of law already out there residing with the regulatory agencies. If the bank regulators, for example, will pick up the tools that are available to them and use them, they can begin to move the needle. They can begin to make this a safer economy. They had the tools. This is something everyone has to pay attention to. In the whole build-up to the financial crisis, the problem was not that practices were not illegal in terms of a lot of what was going on around the mortgages, like I just said, around the servicing. It was that the regulators were, I can't hear you, I can't see you. They didn't get out and enforce the rules. They didn't use the tools that were available to them. So having regulators that will pick up those tools and use them, and I'm going to say here, before I get all depressed about the parts that haven't happened, it's also possible to encourage the regulators to do the right thing. This is how transparency fits in and hearings fit in. But there are regulators, I think, that are really starting to figure this out. Gina McCarthy, head of the Environmental Protection Agency, go Gina. She's from Massachusetts. She worked with 5 different governors. She's tough, she's strong, and she's looking for every tool she can find within the Environmental Protection Agency to make that agency fulfill its mission. And God bless her. So that's what I would do. Those would be my first 3 wishes, and if you give me 3 more, we just go forever. But I'll take those.
Okay. We have several versions of this question, which shouldn't surprise you given we're at university. Basically, it's what policies should the federal government do to make higher education and college more affordable for everybody?
Okay, so this has got 2 parts to it. You all know this. One is the cost of college itself. There are things we need to do to bring down the cost of college. The second part is the student loan debt and the kind of profits that the government is making off student loans right now. So let me just hit both of those as fast as I can. I mean, after all, I am an academic, so it still takes me 15 minutes to clear my throat. So, okay. So, bringing down the cost of college. Let me just talk about one thing we could do. I've got a bill with Senator Jack Reed out of Rhode Island and Senator Dick Durbin out of Illinois. And the idea behind this bill is to say, look, the United States government puts out literally tens of billions of dollars every year in student loans. And the students are responsible for repaying. If they don't, the taxpayer will pick up the bill between those two. But the school itself bears no responsibility, and the government uses no leverage off those billions of dollars. So think of it this way. Suppose instead we said schools have got to have a little skin in the game too. And so you pick 3 or 4 criteria about what's happening at cost escalation and tuition. Or let me give you another one. How many of the students are actually able to get their degrees in 4 years if it's a 4-year institution, or 2 years if it's a 2-year institution? Or how many students are dropping out or falling out, or even when they graduate, unable to manage the debt so that they are head over heels in debt and in default within months of graduating? You pick some criteria and say, for every school that makes it above that, great, you get 100% of the loan dollars. But for the schools that fall below, it's not a large number of schools, but for the schools down at the bottom, for the schools who are not performing for their students and keeping costs down and helping students get through and helping them get an education, then they don't get 100% of that loan money. They get a smaller fraction of the loan money. And that means, depending on the model of this school, you're going to have some changes in what schools do. But the real point of this is to try to align the incentives so that the schools have the same interest in getting students through in a timely fashion with a decent education. It's about making sure that the U.S. government uses the money it already spends to lever schools that are not working in the best interests of their students to try to keep those costs down. So that's the idea behind it. It's got different pieces. It'll have a lot of, how you make it work. But it's an idea. It's a tool in how to bring down costs. And a tool, by the way, I should say, that leaves open to universities to be different. That's what I believe in this. I really am a believer. Not all schools should be the same, and it should not be the federal government who sits and says, oh, this is what schools should look like. This is the ideal 4-year institution. No, there should be a lot of variety around that. But there are some key pieces that should be there. So having said that, that's a tool about bringing down the costs of college, getting these costs under control in a way that fits with the dynamic enthusiasm of what our American university system is, without trying to put a blanket over that. The other part is about the student loan debt. And understand me on this. I want to see us bring college costs under control. I think it's a much harder problem to solve. But we cannot let that problem blind us to the problem of the debt that's already out there and the debt that's rolling out every year. We are now at $1.2 trillion in student loan debt, and it truly is now. It is growing like a monster. Every year that goes by, it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it gets bigger. And we watch more and more people unable to manage this debt. The Fed did a report last spring that said that student loan debt threatens the economy. Why? Because young people just can't make the moves they need to make. The latest data show 30-year-olds with student loan debt are not buying homes at the rate they were doing even a decade ago, that they can't start their economic lives. So what's the answer there? Well, I'll tell you the first answer. The United States government should not be making a profit off the backs of our students. The student loan system, let's clap over that one. That is actually a good one. Just the loans made between 2007 and 2012, just the undergraduate loans, I want you to listen to this, just that little patch of loans right now is scheduled, according to the CBO, to earn for the United States government $66 billion in profits. In profits. Think about that. That means net of all the student loan losses that people have to write off the debt, the administrative costs for doing this, $66 billion in profits. The United States government should not be making a profit off the student loan program. It is making profits off the part of the loan program that is called the subsidized loan program. Little did you realize that subsidized here means that the students are subsidizing the operations of the federal government. When they take out these loans. These loans are money makers for the United States government, and this is fundamentally wrong. So what do we need to do on this? We need to refinance that student loan debt down. I mean, there's just no other way around this. If you have a mortgage, you can refi down now that interest rates are low. You got a car loan, you can refi down now that interest rates are low. You can refi all the loans except the student loans, as some of you in this audience may already know. You get locked in your loans and you're not permitted to refinance them down. That is outrageous for the government to take that position. So what we have to do, and that's what we're going to start working on this spring. I'll just let you all in on a little secret on this. I just always tell 400 of my closest friends. But you are my closest friends in this, and here's why you're my closest friends in this. We are going to have to fight for this, because in order to make it happen, you've got to say right now, under the rules of budgeting in the United States Senate, there's going to be a big argument, so how are you going to pay for it? And that means we really are going to approach on student loans. So where do you want to make the investments? Are we really going to make the investments in the loopholes, the tax loopholes that benefit billionaires? Or are we going to be willing to stitch some of those up and say no, instead we'll make the investments in bringing down the costs of student loans? But that is the next debate we're going to have in the United States Senate, and we got to win this one. We have to.
Okay.
We got to do this.
I think we are out of time.
Oh, can we do one more question?
Please, I'm sorry. I just have to find out, what are we going to do with the situation right now developing in Russia? This is looking like a world war.
I know.
Russia comes in on the side of Ukraine, which there are massive troops now. NATO comes in on the other side. We have absolutely World War III in our hands right now. Obama and the State Department backed that coup inside of Ukraine. They backed Nazis to take the country over. And this is where the situation is. And I don't know if there's any way to stop this thing unless we throw him out. He should be impeached for this coup and others.
Okay. Would you like?
So, look, no, you are right. The situation in Ukraine is enormously dangerous to the United States and to the world. There is no doubt about that. Right now, we're getting unfolding information not just every single day, it's every single hour. And the question about whether or not Ukraine will hold together or whether Ukraine will be caught in a conflict that is both internal and that becomes part of a larger external conflict is what we're struggling with, and our allies are struggling with, people all around the nation. So I think the idea that we jump, as you suggest in your question, to knowing what the answer is, I just think you're wrong at this point. We're working on this, and that's the best we can do. So,
okay. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Senator Warren for these great remarks.
Thank you very much.